everyone, my name is May Park. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're a returning subscriber, hello my crafty friends, thank you for coming back. Today I'm going to show you guys how I made this messy and easy watercolor card using the stamps and inks from Altenew. I'll be creating my own background using the watercolor stamping technique. I almost didn't share this card as I wasn't happy with how my background turned out halfway in the video. So you'll see how I saved my card in the end. As usual, I'll show you my craft desk after my project is done, so make sure to watch the video until the end. Before I start, I'm gonna give you a quick overview of Altenew's July 2019 release products. If you don't want to watch, feel free to skip this part to jump on the card making process. Now I'm going to turn on some music and I'll be back soon. Altenew also released the stamping mat this month. This silicone grid mat is great for stamping, watercolor, ink branding, heat embossing, and everyday crafting. Please note that due to the white color of the mat, using inks or coloring mediums may stain the mat. Today I'll be using the new pen sketched flower stamp set from Altenew. The stamp set has beautiful floral images that are great for coloring or for monochromatic stamping. For today's card, my inspiration came from the sample card included on the insert card and the background design from the Altenew Misty Meadows washi tape. I chose this stamp set because the images feature the right amount of details for heat embossing technique that I'm gonna try in this video. I love the loose watercolor look on the leaves and gold foil accents from the Misty Meadows washi tape. So I create a shadow background using the solid images from the leaf cluster stamp set and heat emboss the outline images from the pen sketched flower stamp set. I thought the solid images from the leaf cluster stamp set are perfect for the watercolor stamping technique that I'm gonna try in today's video. I already cut my watercolor paper into 4 1/4 inch by 5 1/2 inches out of Archie's cold pressed watercolor paper 140 pound. Then I placed my watercolor paper inside my original misted stamping tool and used magnets to hold the paper in place. Next, I'm going to choose my ink colors from Altenew Crisp Dye Ink Collection, inspired by the color combination from the Misty Meadows washi tape. Since I'll be mixing the ink colors to create my own colors, I will only need 2 or 3 ink pads. After placing my stamps on the watercolor paper, I'm going to pick up the stamps with a misty door. Then I'll be inking up my stamps with bamboo ink. Next, I'm going to spritz my stamps with a water spray. To get a better result, you need to use a fine spray so you don't spray your ink away. Then I'm going to stamp the images onto my watercolor paper. There are some areas that didn't stamp well because they didn't get wet enough. So I'm going to soften the stamped images using my wet watercolor paintbrush. You can apply a different color at this point to add some interest if you want. Next, I'll be inking up my stamps with the moss ink. I'm only applying my ink to the bottom of my leaves as I wanted to create a slight color transition on my images while the colors mix together in some areas. Then I'll coat my stamps with a layer of moisture by misting it with water using my water spray. I'm stamping the images again to add layers in a darker shade of green color. You don't need to use the misty stamping tool for watercolor stamping technique. Instead, you can use an acrylic block for stamping. One of the reasons I'm using the stamping tool today is that I want to add some depth and layers by applying different colors for each stamping while I stamp the image on the same position. If you are a beginner at this watercolor stamping technique, I recommend you choose a large image, as tiny images can get lost depending on the amount of water you add. If you don't want your previous ink to transfer to another ink pad, you can use a baby wipe to remove the ink on the stamps before you move on to the next color. Since I'm using the ink pads from the same ink color family, I don't worry about contaminating my ink pads. I'm going to repeat the same process until I create a background of leaves on the entire panel. Inking, misting, stamping, and inking again. To get more controlled results, I'm inking a stamp and misting it with water before stamping. If you want to get more of a bleeding effect, you can also ink up your stamp with ink and stamp it and then mist it over your stamped images. Or you can mist water onto your watercolor paper before stamping instead of misting water onto the stamp. Every result will be different, so give it a try and see which one works for you. I chose Altenew inks today because they are water-based, so the inks react with water well. Instead of inks, you can also use the water-based markers. Just apply your markers directly onto the stamps and mist it with the water, and then stamp the images. If your stamped image has too much water on it, you can dab away the water with a paper towel. By the way, I'm stamping my images on the 2C side of my watercolor paper as it helps me add more texture on the stamped images, and the water stays longer on the surface so I can easily move around the colors with my paintbrush. I recommend you always start with light colors so you have enough room to add more colors later in case you want to enhance the colors. Depending on how you coat your stamp with water, you'll get a different result every time you stamp. Just be careful not to apply too much water at once. You can always add more water later if needed. Once my stamping is done, I'm going to dry my panel with a heat tool to speed up the drying time. Now it's time to do some heat embossing. I'm prepping my watercolor panel with anti-static powder to prevent any stray powder from sticking to unwanted areas while heat embossing. This time, I'm going to use the rose gold embossing powder as I wanted to add a warm tone look to my images. I'm going to pull out the stamps from the pen sketched flower stamp set. Then I'm moving around my stamps on my watercolor panel to make sure the orientation of my stamps is coordinating with the direction of my leaves. Once I'm happy with the placement of my stamps, I'm going to ink up my stamps with alternate embossing ink and stamp the images a few times on the paper. Since I'm stamping on the watercolor paper, it's hard to get clean embossed images because of the texture on the watercolor paper. So I'm making sure that I transfer my images well on the paper by pressing the misty door hard with even pressure. While the ink is still wet, I'm going to sprinkle some Altenew rose gold embossing powder over the images and tap the excess powder off my paper. I'm using my dry paintbrush to flick away any stray powder from sticking to unwanted areas. Then I heat set my images using a heat tool until they are completely melted. I have a few spots with embossing powder on the leaves, so I'm going to remove them carefully using a craft knife. Make sure to work slowly so you don't tear off your paper. Actually, this was the moment when I felt like I was making a craft. The leaf background didn't look good with the gold embossed florals. This wasn't the look that I expected. I wasn't sure how to proceed with my card and I almost threw it away. Then I decided to color the entire background, mostly focusing on the floral images. I'm going to pull out my watercolor paintbrush, size number 10, as it can hold lots of water at once. You will find it more easy with a large paintbrush when you need to color the entire background. Now I'm squeezing my ink pads onto the Altenew stamping mat and picking up the colors with my wet paintbrush. I'll be using a couple of colors from the Cherry Blossom Crisp Star ink set, Ruby Light and Raspberry. You can use watercolor paints or markers if you want, but I wanted to show you how you can get more out of your water-based dye inks. Then I'm going to watercolor my images loosely. I'm not going to worry about the colors going outside the embossed images. I'll use my Altenew inks again and start watercoloring between the images using watercolor wash technique. You can also start by applying lots of water over watercolor paper so the color moves around easily when you apply ink. Once you are done with the first layer, you can apply darker colors here and there to get a more interesting look. Please make sure that you start with a good amount of water on your paintbrush to achieve a more organic look. Once my coloring is done, I'm going to dry my panel using a heat tool to speed up the drying time. My watercolor paper got warped from watercoloring and heat tool. So I'm going to cover my watercolor panel with a print paper and place it under some heavy book to make it flatten for about 15 minutes. If you are not in a hurry to complete your card, I recommend you leave it under the book overnight. Now it's time to assemble my card. I'm going to mount my watercolor panel on the A2 size top folding white card base using double-sided tape. I'm using a random sentiment banner to help me decide which side of my panel should go on the top. Here is a plastic container full of my sentiment leftovers. I store all of my sentiment leftovers in a plastic container for future projects, but that's also useful when I'm not sure which type of sentiments will go with my card design. Next, I'm going to pull out some of the sentiment banners and place them over my card front to decide types of font, size, and color of my sentiment. I think I like the white heat embossed sentiment with a clean and simple font on black cardstock. I'm prepping a piece of black cardstock with anti-static powder bag to remove any moisture, static, and oils. This step helps prevent any stray powder from sticking to unwanted areas. I'm going to pull out several stems from Altenew Sentiment Strips stem set as I wasn't sure which sentiment would go with my card design. Since I'll be stamping several stems at once, I'm going to use my original Misty stamping tool. I'm lining up my stems in straight using the grid lines on the Misty door. Then I'll ink up the stems with Altenew embossing ink and stamp the sentiments on the paper. While the ink is still wet, I'm going to sprinkle some Altenew pure white embossing powder over the sentiments and tap the excess powder off my paper. If you have any stray powder left on your paper, you can use a dry paintbrush and piercing tool to flick away. Then I heat set my sentiments with a heat tool until the embossing powder is completely melted, making sure not to heat over the same area for a long time. Please be careful not to touch the embossed sentiments until they are cool, otherwise you will smudge your embossed sentiments. Next, I'm going to trim my sentiment onto a thin banner using a craft knife and cut a line from my sweet petunia. I'll be mounting the sentiment banner on the card front using 3M foam tape to give some dimension. I'm using my T-square ruler to place my sentiment banner in straight. Next, I'm going to dress up inside my card using the sentiment and images from the Something Wonderful stamp set. I'm using the Altenew Obsidian Pigment ink, which is my favorite black ink when it comes to stamping sentiments. This oil-based black pigment ink is perfect for stamping extremely fine and detailed sentiments and images, and it works for watercoloring as well as it's waterproof. To add some interest to my background, I decided to add some embellishments from Studio KTM. I'm using a jewel picker to pick up my embellishments easily. I'm not sure if I should have left my background clean and simple without embellishments. I have mixed feelings about it. What do you think? The watercolor stamping technique is a great way to get beautiful watercolor results with very little effort. If you haven't tried it yet, I strongly recommend you give it a go. It is a super easy stamping technique that gives you the look of watercolor. Anyone can achieve the great watercolor look of hand-painted images while you are using stamps and inks. This is it for today. If you watched all the way to the end, thanks so much. I hope this video was inspiring or informative for you guys. I'll link all the products and everything that I talked about in the description box below. If you have any questions, just write them below and I'll be happy to answer them for you. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you haven't done it yet, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more card making videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye bye!